we're going to graph from standard form of an equation. So remember last time we talked about what standard form of an equation is, and that was ax plus by equals c. Okay, where we said a, b, and c are all numbers that are not zero. A and b have to be whole numbers, so they can't be fractions, and a must be a positive number. So today we're going to graph from standard form. So last time we wrote standard form equations, today we're going to graph from standard form. When we graph from standard form, we can get y by itself like we're used to, and then graph using our y-intercept and our slope, but there's another way to do it as well. So from standard form, we can find the slope by using this formula m equals negative a over b. And a and b come straight from our standard form equation. They're the coefficients of x and y. So we just plug them into that formula, then we have our slope. Once we have our slope, we can also plot our x-intercept and our y-intercept. So when we plot the x-intercept, or let's start with the y-intercept. We know what a y-intercept is. That's the number where it crosses the y-axis. On the y-axis, x is 0. So we plug that 0 into our equation for x, and we solve for y to figure out where it's going to cross the y-axis. Similarly, the x-intercept is where our graph crosses the x-axis. So on the x-axis, y is 0 this time, so we plug 0 in for y and solve for x to figure out where our line will cross the x-axis. So we're going to plot those intercepts first, and then if we want to find other points, we can move using our slope. But we are going to find our slope just to get in the habit of finding slope from standard form, just so we know another way to find it. So let's look at our first example. Not example 2, but our first example, 3x minus 4y equals 24. So first we're going to find our slope by plugging into this formula m equals negative a over b, a divided by b. So first we need to identify, remember a is always with x, b is always with y. So we know a is going to equal 3, b is going to equal negative 4. So we're just going to take those two numbers and we're going to plug them into our formula. So we have negative a, and a is 3, divided by b, which is negative 4. Now this negative sign belongs to either a or b. You get to decide really. I'm going to always put it with a, but it doesn't matter. You just need to put it with one or the other. You decide which one it goes with. So once we plug in our numbers, we have negative 3 divided by negative 4. So to simplify that, a negative divided by a negative is going to give us a positive, and then we cannot reduce the fraction 3 over 4, so we're going to leave it as 3/4. So we know our slope here is going to be positive 3 over 4. That's going to be our rise over run. Now let's find our x-intercept and our y-intercept so we can plot those 2 points and then find other points using our slope. So to find the x-intercept, we're going to plug in 0 for y into our equation and solve for x. So we've got 3x minus 4, but for y we're going to plug in 0 equals 24, and then we'll simplify. So 0 times anything just gives us 0, so that's going to become a 0 there. And 0 plus anything is whatever you're adding it to. So that's going to leave us with 3x equals 24. And then to solve for x, we're going to divide by 3. And that's going to give us x equals 8, which means our x-intercept will be the point 8, 0. So we just solved for 8, and we plugged in 0 for y. So that's how we create that point 8, 0. We're going to follow the same process here, except we're going to find the other variable. So now for our y-intercept, we're going to plug in 0 for x and solve for y. So we'll have 3 times 0 minus 4y equals 24. Okay, similar to our x-intercept, 0 times anything is going to be 0. And 0 plus or minus anything is going to be whatever you're adding or subtracting. So that leaves us with negative 4y equals 24. And then our last step, divide by negative 4. That's going to leave us with y equals negative 6. So if we write that as a coordinate point, it's going to be 0, negative 6. Where that negative 6 comes from what we just solved for. The 0 comes from the 0 we plugged in for x. Alright, now that we've solved for both intercepts, we're ready to graph. So we'll plot our point 8, 0 on the x-axis. We'll plot our point negative 6 on the y-axis. And then I'm going to use that slope of 3/4 to just find a couple other points that sit on my graph. So it doesn't matter which point you move from. You can still move from the y-intercept if you want. So this is our 3/4 is our rise over run. So from negative 6, I'm going to move up 3, right 4, plot a point. So then I find a point right there in between of my two intercepts. If I go the opposite direction, I could move down 3 and left 4 to find another point on my graph. So when you're plotting a line, you only really need 2 points to find the direction your line is going to go in. But using the slope just gives us a couple other points on our line to kind of fill in those gaps. So once you've got your points plotted, draw your line through your points, and you're done. Alright, so to review real quick, to find our slope this time, keeping it in standard form instead of getting y by itself, we just identified the values for a and b, and then plug them into that formula, negative a divided by b. And then simplify, so in this case it simplified to a positive 3/4. Then we find our two intercepts, our x-intercept and our y-intercept. For the x-intercept, we plug in 0 for y so that we can solve for x. And then for the y-intercept, we plug in 0 for x so that we can solve for y. Once we've got those two intercepts, just plot your points. You can use the slope to find other points. You don't really have to. And then draw your line through your points. So let's try it on one more example here. First, let's find our slope. So remember our slope formula for standard form is going to be negative a over b. In this case, a is 3 and b is 0.5. So when we plug those in, we have negative 3 divided by 0.5. Now 0.5 is the fraction 1/2. So really it's negative 3 divided by 1/2. And we've talked about in the past, when we divide by a fraction, we're really multiplying by its reciprocal. So instead of dividing by 1/2, we're really multiplying by 2. And negative 3 times 2 gives us negative 6. So our slope would turn out to be negative 6 over 1. But you can also plug that into your calculator, negative 3 divided by 0.5, and you'll see that you also get negative 6 out. Okay. Now let's find our two intercepts. So for the x-intercept, this is when we plug in 0 for y. Okay, we want to be left with our x variable so that we can solve for it. So we'll have 3x plus 0.5, but for y we're going to plug in 0 equals 6, and now we can simplify. So 0 times anything is 0, so that leaves us with 3x equals 6, and then divide by 3 so that we get x equals 2. So our x-intercept will be the point 2, 0, which will be positive 2 on the x-axis there. Now for the y-intercept. So the opposite this time, we're going to plug in 0 for x because we want to be left with our y variable. So we'll have 3 for x, we're going to plug in 0, plus 0.5y equals 6. And then simplify, so 3 times 0 is 0, That leaves us with 0.5y equals 6. And then divide by 0.5. But like we talked about when we were solving for our slope, when we divide by 0.5, that's like dividing by 1/2. And dividing by 1/2 is just like multiplying by 2. So 6 times 2 is going to give us 12, which means our y-intercept will be the point 0, 12. So that'll be 12 on the y-axis, which is going to take us off the grid just a little bit. It's only 2 off the graph, so you can still plot it. But this is kind of where our slope comes in handy. If one of our intercepts goes off the graph even further than 12, it's not going to be very convenient or sometimes possible for us to plot that y-intercept. So then we can find other points using our slope. So let's do that. If our slope is -6 over 1, that means we are moving down 6, right 1, or up 6, left 1. So from the point that is on my graph, my x-intercept, I'm going to move down 6 and right 1. Or vice versa, I could move up 6 and, I think I went up too much, and left 1. Okay, and then those give me points that are a lot easier to graph than this y-intercept that went a little bit off the graph. So then once you have those points plotted, draw your line, and you're good to go. Obviously that's not exactly through the points, but that's okay. All right. Feel free to watch back through this video. I will post these notes on Google Classroom as well, because at the very beginning of these notes we did have one example where it asks you to solve for a missing coefficient. So in this case they're asking you to solve for this missing b value. And just like when we were trying to decide if a point was a solution or not, you're just going to take this point that they gave you and plug it into your equation. So I plugged in 2 for x and -1 for y, and then I just solve for b. Once I have my value of b, which is 7, I just plug it back into the equation they gave me for b so that I have an equation in standard form. Okay, so these will be posted on Google Classroom as well. Watch the video as many times as you need to. Make sure you understand it and then get started on your homework.